Imagine this. You walk into a huge Gothic cathedral in Europe, cold stone, a ceiling like the sky, hundreds of statues staring down, thin columns holding thousands of tons of weight. And then you hear the title in your head, Mathematically Impossible. Who really built Europe's great cathedrals? We're told these giants were built in just a few decades, with no cranes, no electricity, no computers, only horses, ropes, and hammers. But when you take the official numbers, population, years of work, tons of stone, the math starts to scream. This does not add up. Where are the records of the workers, the food, the roads, the tools, the planning? How do small, poor towns suddenly build something our best engineers still struggle to copy? And why does the same story repeat across Europe? A simple wooden church burns down, and on its ashes a stone giant appears. If the math breaks the story, if the people of that time could not have done this with what they had, then one question will not go away. Who really built Europe's great cathedrals, and what part of our history is missing? Let's stay inside that cathedral for a moment longer. The tourists around you whisper. Candles flicker against stone older than most nations. Light pours through stained glass windows, reds, blues, golds, painting the floor in shifting shapes as the sun moves. Somewhere deep inside the walls, an organ hums like a distant storm. This is not just beautiful. It feels wrong, too perfect, too big, too early for its time. Look up. The vault above you, that curved stone ceiling, rises 40, sometimes 50 meters into the air. That is the height of a 15-story building, made of stone, held together by nothing but gravity and the angle of every single block. No steel beams, no reinforced concrete, just stone on stone, locked in place, perfectly balanced for almost 800 years. Now, look at the columns holding it all up. They are thin, shockingly thin for what they carry. You have seen office buildings with thicker support beams, and those buildings are holding up glass and drywall, not millions of kilograms of hand-carved rock. Walk closer to the walls. Hundreds of statues. In some cathedrals, maybe thousands. Each one unique. Different faces, different poses, different stories frozen in limestone. The kind of detail that today would demand a team of sculptors working months on a single piece. And yet, we are told this was all done in about 80 years, maybe 100 if we are generous, by people who lived in wooden houses, who washed once a week, if that, who had no engines, no electricity, no phones, no radio to coordinate the work, just horses, ropes, hammers, and faith. The official story is clean and simple. A town decides to build a great cathedral to honor God. Workers gather. Stone is cut from nearby quarries. Slowly, year after year, the structure rises. A bishop oversees the project. An architect, sometimes named, often not, draws the plan. Decades pass. Generations live and die. And finally, the doors open. A masterpiece stands where once there was only earth. It sounds inspiring. It sounds reasonable. Until you ask the next question. If we had to rebuild one of these cathedrals today, with all our cranes, laser levels, computer models, and engineering degrees, could we actually do it? Some architects say yes, others are not so sure. There are tricks hidden in these walls that modern engineers still argue about. Load paths that seem impossible on paper, but work in real stone. Acoustic designs that carry a whisper across 50 meters of space. Geometry so precise that some blocks sit together without mortar, tight enough that a knife blade cannot slip between them. This does not feel like primitive work. It does not look like the output of a society that, we are told, was drowning in plagues, wars, and mud. So, who are we really looking at when we look up at these stones? That is the question that will not let go. Because once you notice that quiet unease under the awe, you cannot unsee it. You begin to spot details. The age of the stone does not always match the official construction date. The foundations beneath some cathedrals are older, stranger, built in a different style entirely. The tools we are told were used should not be able to make cuts this clean or joints this exact. And then there is the wider pattern. These cathedrals did not appear alone. Reims, Chartres, Notre Dame, Cologne, Canterbury, Burgos, Milan, They rose across Europe like a wave, in roughly the same era, on roughly the same impossible scale, as if someone hit copy-paste on an idea that should not have existed yet. Stand here long enough, and the feeling grows. This place is older than its story, larger than its explanation, shaped by hands we have never truly met. The world feels a little less stable, and the investigation is only just beginning. Mathematics has a way of slicing straight through the poetry. So, let's take one cathedral, Cologne, for example, and do something historians almost never do in public: actually count. The Cologne Cathedral contains an estimated 300,000 tons of stone. 300,000 tons. That is not a dramatic metaphor. That is the weight engineers calculated when they studied the structure. To put it in perspective, it is heavier than 2 fully loaded aircraft carriers, parked not in a modern port, but in the middle of a medieval town. Now, the official story says construction took about 600 years in total, but the main body of the cathedral, the part that defines the structure, was supposedly raised in phases over roughly 200 to 300 active years, with the most intense building happening in 80-year bursts. Let's be generous. Let's give them 1 full century of steady, focused work. 300,000 tons divided by 100 years. That is 3,000 tons per year. Divide that by 365 days. You get more than 8 tons of stone, quarried, transported, carved, lifted, and locked into place every single day for a century. Every single day. No holidays, no winters shut down by snow and ice. No plagues, wars, or famines slowing everything to a crawl. And it gets worse. Those stones did not magically appear next to the building site. Many cathedrals drew their limestone from quarries 20, 30, sometimes 50 kilometers away. In an age with no trucks, no railways, just wooden carts, horses, and dirt roads that turned into rivers of mud every time it rained. How many carts do you need to move 8 tons of stone a day, every day, for 100 years? How many horses pulling those carts? How many workers loading and unloading each block? How many blacksmiths to repair wheels and shoe animals? How many stable hands just to feed and water the beasts that drag the stone? And that is only transportation. Now add the quarry workers cutting the raw blocks, the stone carvers shaping details and statues, the masons laying each course, the carpenters building endless scaffolding, the rope makers twisting new lines, the pulley operators managing lifts, the laborers hauling water, food, and materials to everyone else. Historians estimate that a project like this, at its peak, would have required between 2,000 and 5,000 workers on site at the same time. Not for a week, for decades. Pause on that number: 5,000 people. That is not just a workforce. That is an entire ecosystem. You must house them, feed them 3 times a day, clothe them, pay them, or at least keep them alive and motivated enough not to vanish back to their villages. In the Middle Ages, most towns had total populations between 5,000 and 20,000 people, and most of those inhabitants were peasants needed in the fields just to keep everyone from starving. So, where did this army of builders come from? Here, the records fall silent. We have no payroll books, no lists of hired hands, no contracts, no detailed orders, no surviving rosters of names. No angry letters about missed payments or unsafe conditions, even though medieval people loved to write complaints when taxes, debts, or obligations felt unfair. What we do have are vague lines in chronicles that say things like, "The work continued under the grace of God. Many hands contributed to the glory of the church." That is all. No hard numbers, no logistics, no supply chains. If we tried to build something on this scale today, we would drown in paperwork. Thousands of pages of safety rules, delivery schedules, engineering drawings, shift plans, insurance documents, contracts with every supplier and subcontractor. According to the official story, they had none of that. Or if anything like it ever existed, every trace has vanished. All of it, neatly erased by time, but the cathedral itself is still here, solid, enormous. Impossibly precise. And here is the strangest part. This is not a one-off miracle. The same pattern repeats across Europe. Chartres. Roughly 100 years, similar scale. Notre Dame de Paris, officially about 180 years, but the main body raised in under a century. Rams, around 80 years for the bulk of the work. Always the same rhythm, always the same missing numbers, always the same silence around how small, poor, plague-hit towns somehow coordinated projects that would stretch even our modern systems to the limit. The math does not just raise an eyebrow, the math rips through the official timeline. Unless we are ready to accept literal miracles as a construction method, and maybe that is exactly what they prefer us to think, then something else was going on, something the chronicles do not spell out. Something the schoolbooks slide past in a single sentence. And that leads us to the next crack in the story. Why do so many of these cathedrals begin with the exact same origin myth? It always starts with fire. You see it again and again in the chronicles. One simple pattern, copied across dozens of cities and stretched over hundreds of years. A great fire consumed the old wooden church. In its place, by the grace of God, a magnificent stone cathedral was raised. Rams 12:10. Fire destroys the old church. Within a year, construction begins on one of the most ambitious Gothic structures ever built. Chartres 1194. Flames ravage the town and its cathedral. Almost immediately, work starts on the Gothic masterpiece we see today. Canterbury 1174. Fire guts the choir. The rebuild suddenly brings French Gothic into England for the very first time. Bourges, Rouen, Amiens, the list keeps growing. Fire, destruction, then stone. On the surface, it feels logical. A town loses its church, grieves, and decides to rebuild bigger and better. Tragedy becomes opportunity. That sounds like something people would do. But when you line these accounts up side by side, something unsettling appears. They sound identical, not just similar in tone, not inspired by each other. Almost the exact same story, with only the names and dates swapped out. Look closer at 3 examples. Rams, 1210. After the devastating fire, the bishop called upon the faithful. Builders came from across the land. The work began swiftly, guided by divine will. Chartres, 1194. When the flames took the old church, the people wept. But soon masons arrived, and the foundation of a greater house of God was laid. Strasbourg, 1176. The fire cleansed the old structure. In its wake, a vision of stone and light was born. Built by the hands of the devoted. Do you see it? The same beats, the same soft holy language, the same mysterious arrival of skilled builders exactly when they are needed. No names, no contracts, no guild records, no trace of where these master masons came from or where they went afterward. Just builders came, as if they stepped out of the smoke, did the impossible, and then dissolved back into legend. And here's where it gets even stranger. In most of these cases, we do not have detailed, contemporary records from the actual construction years. What we have are chronicles written 50, 100, sometimes 200 years after the cathedral was finished. Texts compiled by monks or church officials whose job was to glorify the project and the institution, not to document budgets, delays, or supply problems. History was being written backwards, and when you write history backwards, it is easy to sand down the rough edges. You can smooth over gaps, add a handy fire here, credit a bishop there, turn chaos, conflict, and compromise into one clean, uplifting miracle story. But why fire specifically? Because fire is the perfect explanation. Think about it. If you need a reason why a small wooden church disappears, and in its place, a huge stone cathedral suddenly stands, fire solves every problem at once. It wipes out physical traces. It creates urgency and drama. It explains why earlier documents are gone. They burned, of course. Fire also justifies a total reset in style. Why does this new cathedral look nothing like the supposed earlier building? Why is the scale completely different? Simple. The old one burned. We had to start from scratch. Neat. Too neat. Now, to be fair, fires were absolutely common in the Middle Ages. Timber buildings, open flames, no organized fire brigades, churches did burn. That part is not a fantasy. But the pattern is what begins to feel wrong. The blazes always seem to strike at the exact moment a town is supposedly ready to attempt something far beyond its known capacity. They always destroy just enough to justify a complete rebuild. and they always lead directly to the sudden arrival of architectural knowledge that, on paper, should not exist in that region yet. It starts to feel less like random disaster and more like a storytelling device, a narrative reset button, a way of saying, do not ask too many questions about what stood here before. Do not ask where the builders really came from. Do not ask how this was financed or organized. There was a fire. That is all you need to know. And for centuries, we nodded and moved on. But once you notice the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Darker questions creep in. Were these fires pure accidents or convenient excuses? Were the cathedrals truly built after the fires? Or were some of them already there, and the fire story was added later to wrap the mystery in a pious legend? If the chronicles can be this vague, this repetitive, this perfectly convenient about something as huge as the birth of a cathedral, what else are they smoothing over? The official story is starting to split at the seams. The numbers do not work, the logistics are missing, and the fires arrive with suspicious precision, which leads us to the people who supposedly designed these impossible buildings. The architects, the masters, the geniuses, or, as we are about to discover, the ghosts. Every great building has a name behind it. The Eiffel Tower, Gustave Eiffel, the Sydney Opera House, Jörn Utzon, the Burj Khalifa, Adrian Smith. We know these people. We can look them up. We have their drawings, notes, interviews. We know where they trained, who shaped their style, which projects came before and after. Their work sits inside a clear human story. Now, try doing the same thing with Gothic cathedrals. Who designed Rheims? The official answer, Jean d'Orbais. Also written as Jean d'Or, John of Gold. A beautiful name, almost too perfect. But here is the problem. Beyond the name, there is almost nothing. No surviving drawings in his own hand. No letters, no contracts, no detailed plans explaining how he meant to lift stone almost 38 meters into the air and keep it there for centuries. No record of where he studied, who mentored him, or which smaller buildings he practiced on first. No clear list of other confirmed projects at all. Just a name, carved into a labyrinth on the cathedral floor. Added centuries after construction began. That is the entire file. The man credited with shaping one of the most complex structures in medieval Europe is barely more than a whisper. Let's try another. Notre Dame de Paris. Who was the architect? The documents mention a bishop, Maurice de Sully, who ordered the cathedral. But he was the client, not the designer. The actual mind behind the structure? Unknown. Later writers guessed maybe Jean de Chelles, maybe Pierre de Montreuil, but they only appear in records decades after the project started, when the foundation was already in place and the hardest structural choices were finished. The person who first imagined the flying buttresses, the great rose windows, the rib vault system that makes Notre Dame even possible. Gone. Anonymous. Lost in fog. One more. Chartres Cathedral. Architect, unknown. Not, historians are unsure between several candidates. Not, there is a debate in the field. Simply, we do not have a name, not even a widely accepted guess. This building, with some of the most precise acoustics and light control in the medieval world, a structure that still puzzles modern architects, is officially the work of nobody we can point to. Do you see the pattern? The greatest architectural achievements of an entire era, buildings that demand serious knowledge of mathematics, geometry, engineering, acoustics, and optics, are attributed to ghosts. Now, compare that to the Renaissance just a few centuries later. Filippo Brunelleschi designs the dome of Florence Cathedral. For him, we have models, writings, tools, even records of the competition he entered against other architects. We know his rivals. We know his pupils. Historians can tell you what he argued about, who blocked his ideas, how he won. Michelangelo works on St. Peter's Basilica. We have his letters, sketches, contracts, complaints, payment disputes. His life is almost over-documented. We know everything. Yet, go back only 200 years to the Gothic masters, and the trail goes cold. Why? The standard answer sounds reasonable on the surface. Record-keeping was poor in the Middle Ages. Many documents were lost. Fires destroyed archives. Fires again. But here is the part that does not sit right. We do have medieval paperwork, a lot of it. Tax rolls, property disputes, letters between bishops, complaints about tithes, grain shipment logs, marriage contracts and inheritance quarrels. The boring, everyday stuff survived. Yet the detailed plans for the largest, most ambitious construction projects on the continent, missing, the names of the people who first worked out flying buttresses, rib vaults, and pointed arches, forgotten. The step-by-step instructions that would be needed to teach thousands of workers how to put these designs into stone, nowhere to be seen. It does not add up. If you tried to build a cathedral today, you would need hundreds of architectural drawings, structural calculations, material lists, safety checks, scale models, digital simulations. We are told they had, what exactly? A rough sketch on parchment? A few lines scratched in sand? Verbal instructions passed from master to apprentice on the scaffolding, all for a building made of thousands of individually shaped stones, each cut for one specific place in a three-dimensional puzzle that took decades to complete. That is very hard to believe. Unless the crucial knowledge did not appear out of nowhere in the Gothic age, unless it was inherited. What if these architects were not inventors working from a blank page, but caretakers? What if they were copying, repairing, or extending designs from plans that already existed, plans from a source they could not fully explain or were not allowed to name? That would make the phantom architects suddenly make sense. It would explain why the skill arrives in full form, with almost no trace of crude early attempts. It would explain why the same advanced tricks show up at nearly the same time across distant regions, without any clear path for ideas to spread that quickly. And it would explain the silence. Because if you are not the original creator, if you are just the steward of something far older, then there is no great genius to record, no hero to celebrate, only the work itself, standing, perfect, older than its official story. But if the architects are made of smoke and the timeline itself is bending, there is one more question waiting in the dark, the most dangerous one. What if the people living in Europe during the so-called Age of Cathedrals simply did not exist in large enough numbers to build them at all? Let's run an experiment, not a perfect one, not a new, absolute truth. Just a simple thought experiment that might make you rethink almost everything you were taught about the Middle Ages. We are going to use math, very basic math, the kind anyone can follow, and we are going to walk backwards through time. Here is what we know with confidence. Today, Earth has about 8 billion people. Around the year 1900, there were roughly 1.6 billion. Go back to 1800, about 1 billion. These figures are solid. They come from censuses, tax rolls, birth and death registers. The further into the past we go, the fuzzier the exact numbers become, but historians broadly agree on the general curve. Demographers use something called a population growth rate to estimate how numbers change over time. For most of human history, that rate was tiny, somewhere between 0.04 and 0.1% per year, depending on region and era. So, let us take the official growth rates and run them backwards. Start with the population in 1800, 1 billion people, and apply a yearly growth rate of 0.05%. That is a reasonable estimate for pre-industrial societies. From that, we can work out what the global population should have been in earlier centuries. 1700, around 600 million, 1600, around 500 million, 1500, around 450 million. So far, this lines up with what mainstream history tells us. If you add Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Africa together, you get about 500 million people on Earth around the time Columbus sails. Let's keep walking back. 1400, roughly 400 million. 1300, around 350 million. 1200. The classic Age of Cathedrals, roughly 400 million people worldwide. Now it gets interesting. Out of those 400 million, Europe is estimated to have held only about 60 to 70 million. That is the entire continent, from Portugal to Russia, from Scotland to Sicily. Now, zoom in again. France around 1200, the heartland of great Gothic cathedrals, had perhaps 15 to 17 million people. And the vast majority were peasants in tiny villages, farming just enough land to stay alive. The town of Reims, where one of the largest cathedrals was built, had a population of roughly 18,000 to 20,000 at its peak during the Gothic period. Pause on that number, 18,000. That is the size of a small modern suburb, smaller than many university campuses. From that pool, you are supposed to pull between 2,000 and 5,000 full-time workers for decades to raise the cathedral. At the same time, the fields must still be tilled, markets open, blacksmiths hammering, bakers baking, mills grinding. Do the rough calculation. That is 10 to 25% of the entire town, tied up on a single building site for generations. So, who is growing the food? Who is raising the children? Who is making the tools, cloth, carts, candles, and everything else? The numbers begin to slip. But let's push the model further. Run the same growth rate back a few more centuries. Around the year 1000, perhaps 300 million people worldwide. Europe, maybe 40 million. Around 800, roughly 220 million globally. Europe, perhaps 25 to 30 million. We are now in what is called the early Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages. And the pool of people is shrinking in a way that feels uncomfortable. Now, here comes the really disturbing part. If we keep applying the same growth rate backwards, again, using official demographic models, not fantasy, we eventually hit a wall. The numbers start to collapse. By around 500, you might be looking at roughly 200 million humans on the whole planet. At the time of Rome's final decline, Europe may have had around 20 to 25 million people in total, most of them clustered around the Mediterranean. Northern Europe, the lands that would one day become France, Germany, and England, may have held only 5 to 10 million people, scattered across immense forests, marshes, and wild countryside. And yet, official history tells us that the foundations of many cathedrals are older than the Gothic shells we see today. Some crypts, walls, and stones are dated back to the 6th, 7th, even 8th centuries. That is the period when Europe supposedly had fewer people than modern Australia. And across this thinly populated landscape, we see not just traces of cathedrals, but fortresses, aqueducts, roads, and bridges. Massive works in stone and brick. The math starts to shout. Let us be very clear. This model is simplified. It does not include plagues, crop failures, or wars that cause population crashes and rebounds. It does not handle migration or the differences between regions. But that is exactly the point. Even if we are off by half, even if the real population was double what this backwards model suggests, the main problem remains. The number of available people does not fit the scale of what was supposedly built. You cannot create a continent-wide network of colossal stone structures with a population that would barely fill one modern mega-city. Unless these structures are older than we are told. Unless they were raised by a civilization with far more people. A civilization that existed before the numbers fell off a cliff. Before something happened that we now casually label the Dark Ages, but which may have been something much darker, something catastrophic, a reset. And the people we see in medieval paintings and manuscripts, the ones we imagine swinging hammers on the scaffolding, maybe they were not the original builders at all. Maybe they were just the tenants, moving into a stone world they had inherited, not created. If the cathedrals are older than their official dates, and if medieval Europeans did not truly build them from scratch, then who did? There is a theory, a huge controversial idea, and for a while, just a while, it seems to explain everything. Look at the decorations on Gothic cathedrals, not the saints or the Bible scenes. Look at the other carvings, the ones that feel out of place. Griffins, creatures with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. They are everywhere. On the facades of Notre Dame, crawling up the columns of Chartres, perched high on the roofs of Cologne. Why griffins? They are not biblical. They are not classic Christian symbols. They are older, much older. Now turn your gaze east. Griffins in Persia. Ancient stone carvings more than 2,500 years old. Griffins in Central Asia, stamped on coins, painted on pottery, cut into the walls of Silk Road cities. Griffins in India, guarding temple gates like stone sentries. The same creature, often the same stance, spread across thousands of kilometers. That does not feel like random chance. It looks like a shared symbolic language. And it is not just griffins. Look at the arches and domes, at the star-shaped fortresses that appear from Spain to Siberia. They share strikingly similar geometries and layouts. Now, look at old maps, the ones drawn in the 16th and 17th centuries, before modern atlases fixed them. They show something official history now treats as a misunderstanding: Tartaria, a vast landmass across northern Asia. Sometimes labeled Great Tartary, sometimes split into Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary. For centuries, mapmakers drew it, encyclopedias mentioned it. Travelers wrote about Tartars and lands under that name. Then, by the 19th century, it fades. The label disappears. The territory is chopped into new names. The word Tartaria becomes an old curiosity. The theory goes like this: what if there was once a unified global civilization? Not a single empire with one emperor, but a connected network. A culture that stretched across continents. A world that possessed advanced knowledge of stone construction, geometry, acoustics, maybe even energy systems we no longer understand. They built the great things: the cathedrals, the pyramids, temples in Asia, massive stone fortresses, aqueducts, star forts. All parts of one architectural tradition, expressed differently from region to region, rooted in a common core of knowledge. This civilization, call it Tartaria for convenience, even if that was not its true name, flourished for centuries, maybe for millennia. And then something happened: a cataclysm, a global war, a series of plagues, a shift in the earth itself. We do not know. The theory leaves that blank. The civilization collapsed. Its knowledge evaporated. The population crashed. In the ruins of that world, scattered survivors tried to rebuild. Small, broken societies moved into the empty shells of stone. They did not understand what they had found. They could not reproduce it, but they could occupy it. Temples became churches. Pagan carvings were left in place and wrapped in new stories. Crosses and saints were added on top of older symbols, and when people asked, "Who built this?" a new answer appeared. A fire destroyed the old church. We rebuilt it by the grace of God. In this telling, the griffins, the domes, the impossible engineering are not medieval inventions at all. They are leftovers, fragments of a lost world. For a few minutes, this theory feels like a master key that turns every lock. It explains the missing architects, the impossible construction schedules, the too small populations, the repeated fire stories, the eerie similarities in architecture across continents. It even seems to explain those 19th century photographs where grand cathedrals tower over muddy streets and crooked wooden shacks. The buildings and the people do not match because they are not from the same chapter of history. It explains why so many cathedrals are half buried, their first floors sunk below today's street level, not just because of slow sediment buildup, but because they were raised when ground levels were different, before some flood, mud event, or reset. For a moment, everything clicks, until it doesn't. Here is the problem: there is no hard proof. Yes, old maps show Tartaria, but those same maps also show sea monsters, fantasy islands, and rivers that never existed. Cartographers filled blank spaces with guesswork, rumors, and myth. Yes, there are similarities in architecture across the world, but those can be explained by trade routes, shared mathematical truths, and the way engineering tends to converge on similar solutions. Yes, griffins appear in many cultures, but so do lions, eagles, snakes, and dragons. Common symbols do not require a hidden super-civilization, only human imagination, migration, and exchange. And when you start digging into the modern evidence for Tartaria, things get messy very fast. Photos turn out to be mislabeled or ripped from their original context. Buildings claimed as mystery structures turn out to be well documented in local archives, just not popularized in English. Some maps have been misread, or even quietly edited by modern creators to make the story more dramatic. Many of the most viral images of so-called Tartarian architecture, they are from 19th century World's Fairs, temporary plaster palaces built on steel and wood frames. Grand illusions meant to impress for a summer, then demolished. Not ancient, not supernatural, just clever staging. So, the theory that felt rock solid a moment ago starts to fracture. We end up in a strange, unsettling space. The official story clearly has gaps. The math is suspicious. The records are thin. The timelines wobble. But the alternative stories have gaps too. Weak sources, misread evidence, places where belief rushes in to paper over missing facts. We find ourselves standing between two broken narratives. The experts cannot fully explain the cathedrals. The rebels cannot fully prove their lost civilization. So, where does that leave us? Maybe in the most honest place of all. A place that does not demand blind faith in the textbooks or in the viral threads. A place in the dark between certainty and legend, holding a small torch and one simple task, not to grab the easiest answer, but to start asking much better questions. Maybe we will never know who laid the first stone. Maybe the names are gone for good. Maybe the real timeline lies buried under centuries of edited chronicles, convenient fires, and stories shaped to serve whoever held power. That is a hard thing to swallow. We crave answers. We crave a clear villain, a clear hero, a clear date we can point to and say, there, that is the truth. But what if the truth is not a single clean line, but a gap between stories? A space where we can at least admit something happened, something large, something that snapped the continuity of human civilization in a way we are only now beginning to notice. Let us use the name the theory gives it, the Great Reset. Not a boardroom plot, not a secret club of elites pulling strings, just an event, or a chain of events. Something so huge it crushed populations, shredded knowledge, and left survivors trying to explain a world they inherited but did not build. What could do that? Plague. The Black Death in the 14th century killed roughly a third of Europe. But what if there were earlier waves, forgotten outbreaks, or misstated pandemics that never made it into our clean timelines? War. The Mongol invasions remade Asia. The fall of Rome tore apart the Mediterranean world. Entire cultures have collapsed under armies before. Climate. The Little Ice Age began in the 14th century and lingered for centuries. Crops failed, rivers froze, whole regions starved. Go further back and you find volcanic winters, mega droughts, floods. Nature has pressed the reset button more than once, or something we barely have words for, a magnetic pole shift. A comet or meteor impact, a solar storm, myths from around the world speak of global floods, fire from the sky, nights that lasted too long, suns that burned too bright. We do not know, but here is what we can see. There are photographs, hundreds of them, taken in the middle and late 19th century, in those first decades after photography was born, and they show something that does not quite sit right. Grand cathedrals framed by dirt roads and leaning wooden shacks, massive stone buildings standing over horse carts and people in patched clothing. Ground floors buried below street level, as if the earth itself has crept upward around them. At first glance, these images look ordinary. Of course, the 19th century seems primitive, we tell ourselves. That is just what progress looks like. But when you really study them, the contrast bites. Imagine wandering through a city where half the buildings look like props from a science fiction film. Perfect geometry, advanced engineering, stonework we still struggle to copy. And the other half look like they were thrown together by people who just learned how to stack timber. That is what many of these photos capture. Not a smooth climb from simple huts to complex towers, but two worlds sharing the same street, two levels of technology, two eras layered on top of each other, as if one civilization poured the stone, and another, far later and far less advanced, simply moved in and tried to survive in its shadow. The official answer is straightforward. Cities modernized at different speeds. Stone buildings lasted, wooden ones did not. That is why the mix looks so strange. There is truth in that. But it does not explain why so many stone giants already look ancient in those 19th century frames. Why their first stories are sunken. Why their foundations are clearly older than the houses that cling to them. It does not explain why, in that same century, so many cathedrals needed huge restorations campaigns. Not because they were gently aging under constant use, but because they had been neglected, abandoned, sometimes empty for decades, as if the people living beside them did not really know what these structures were for, as if they had inherited them, not commissioned them. We should be careful here. Some of what we see in those images is perfectly normal for the time. Dirt streets were standard, wood was cheap. The Industrial Revolution rolled out in uneven waves, but the pattern still pokes through, across Europe, across parts of Asia, even in the Americas. You keep finding huge stoneworks that feel out of place, too advanced, too old, surrounded by cultures that, on paper, should not have had the resources or knowledge to raise them. And when you ask, who built this? The local answer, again and again, sounds strangely familiar. It was already here. The ancients made it. We do not know. That phrase, we do not know, shows up more in early sources than you might expect, not in polished school textbooks where every gap is patched, but in the raw material beneath them, in letters from travelers and explorers, in early archaeological notes, in the private journals written before history became a neat, printed narrative. They described things they could not explain. Later, historians came along and quietly filled the holes with confident guesses. Over time, those guesses hardened into facts. This cathedral was built in 1211 by Jean d'Orbais. Maybe. Or maybe Jean d'Orbais was the man who patched it, or renamed it, or wrapped an older structure in a new Christian skin. The honest answer is simple. We do not know, and that is not a defeat. Admitting we do not know is the first step toward asking sharper, braver questions. What if the cathedrals are not only monuments to medieval faith, but also survivors of something older? What if the so-called Dark Ages were not just a time of ignorance, but a time of forgetting? What if the people in our schoolbook illustrations were not the original builders, but refugees, trying to rebuild their lives in the ruins of a world they barely understood? These are not final answers. They are possibilities, open doors, and maybe, for now, that is enough. Because the stones are still here. They are still standing. They are still talking to anyone who is willing to listen. And their story, whatever it really is not finished yet. Let's go back to the cathedral, the same one from the beginning, the one that felt wrong, too perfect, too big, too early for its time. Only now you are different. You have walked through the numbers. You have seen the missing architects, the phantom populations, the convenient fires. You have tried on the big alternative theories and watched some of them crack under the pressure of basic checks. You have stood in that uneasy space between certainty and myth. So, when you step inside again, the cathedral feels different. Not smaller, not less mysterious, just sharper, clearer. Because here is what we actually know, what we can say out loud without reaching for conspiracy on one side or blind faith on the other. These buildings are real. They are not legends or CGI. You can touch the columns, feel the cold stone, count the ribs in the vault. You can measure them, scan them, model them. They have stood through wars, plagues, revolutions, and they are still here. They are incredibly advanced. Modern engineers study their structure and still find tricks that are hard to copy. Acoustic layouts that carry a whisper across 50 meters, load paths that look impossible on paper, but have held millions of tons of masonry for almost 800 years. Geometry so precise that tiny errors vanish in the overall harmony. The official timeline has holes, not cute little gaps, big structural missing pieces. We see places where there should be archives, and we get a few vague lines in a chronicle. Places where there should be named architects, drawings, and schools of students, and instead, we get ghost figures and legends. Population numbers that strain under the weight of the projects they are supposed to support. The alternative theories are unfinished. Tartaria, lost high civilizations, global resets. They pick out real patterns and real oddities, but they do not yet have the hard, verifiable proof needed to replace the standard story. They gesture towards something, but they cannot pin that something down. So, where does that leave us? Right here, in the nave, looking up. And maybe that is exactly where we should be, because the real question was never just, who built this? The deeper question is, what do we do with the fact that we don't know? Do we close our eyes and repeat the school version, even when the math and the logistics whisper that something is wrong? Do we sprint to the opposite extreme? Dive headfirst into every radical theory we see online and write off anyone who disagrees as either brainwashed or corrupt? Or do we attempt the harder path? Do we stay curious? Do we hold that tension between what we know and what we don't know and let it sharpen our minds instead of snapping them? Because here is an uncomfortable truth. History is not a finished book. It is an open case file. New tools keep changing the picture. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR show buried walls, forgotten streets, entire city plans under our feet. DNA analysis redraws migration routes and family trees we thought were settled. Tree ring dating shifts the ages of beams and roofs by decades. Every year, some new study nudges the past further back, makes it stranger, or shows that a solid fact was really just a guess everyone copied. And the cathedrals? They are not in a hurry. They are still speaking, in stone, in angles, in the way sound and light move through their spaces. They are quietly saying, we are not as simple as the story around us. Not just churches, not just monuments to piety or royal ego. They are proof that human beings, whoever they were, whenever they lived, have already reached levels of skill and vision that we, with all our machines and simulations, still struggle to match. They hint that something important happened in our past that did not survive cleanly into our records, something we forgot, or were told to gloss over, or simply lost in the static of time. They show, more than any textbook line, that the story is not complete, and that should not scare us. It should light us up. Because every cathedral that does not quite fit the timeline is not just a problem, it is an invitation to question politely but relentlessly, to look twice at what is obvious, to stop accepting neat answers just because they make the world feel tidy. An invitation to say, I don't know, without shame, and then go digging. The experts do not have every answer, the rebels do not either, but between them, between rigorous testing and bold imagination, we can move closer to understanding not just who built the cathedrals, but what kind of creatures we are. Because if we are not the first civilization to reach for the sky, if we are not the first to master stone, geometry, and light, if we are walking through the echoes of something older, grander, and stranger than we were ever taught, then everything shifts. Our place in history shifts. Our sense of what is possible shifts. Our idea of the future shifts. Because if it happened once, it can happen again. Greatness, collapse, amnesia, rediscovery, the cycle is written in stone, literally. And the cathedrals are still here, waiting for us to finally pay attention. So, the next time you step into one of these impossible spaces, these structures that should not exist according to the neat little numbers, do not just snap a photo and walk out. Stop. Look up. Feel the weight of the question pressing down with the vault. Ask the things no one ever asked you to ask. And remember, wonder is not a glitch in the human story. It is the point. The real power has never been in knowing every answer. It has always been in daring to ask better questions. Subscribe, keep watching, keep questioning. Because this story, it's far from over, and the stones are still speaking.